Let me introduce our speaker for tonight. His name is Jonathan Cervas. He's an assistant teaching professor at Carnegie-Mellon University, specializing in redistricting and voting rights and American political institutions. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of California at Irvine with research on Electoral College and representation. His work appears in journals including the PNAS, which I never bothered to find out what that is.
Proceedings of the National Academy of Science.
Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, I should have known. I see everyone say, yeah. The Journal of Election Law and Political Geography. Dr. Cervas has advised redistricting processes in Pennsylvania, New York, and Wisconsin, including serving as a special master for the New York Supreme Court. His expertise includes political geography and statistical modeling. At CMU, he teaches American government, representation, and electoral systems, linking data-driven research to real-world policies. So with that, Jonathan.
Thank you. Okay, and just to be forthright here, this is not the normal kind of audience I usually speak to, right? I usually speak to students, and I'm usually teaching people who maybe don't have the kinds of experience and life experiences that y'all do, or the kind of political interest that you have. Just from my point of view, I come from a very nonpartisan perspective, non-activist perspective. I try to stick with facts and data, right? So that's where I'm coming from. And so I prepared some slides here, and I hope it's useful. Some of it is going to be way too rudimentary for your likes, so I'm going to try to move through that stuff as quickly as possible and get to the things that I hope are the most interesting. You should feel free to stop me at any moment, right, if you feel confused, lost, or just have general questions. And with that, let me explain to you what I mean by bugs in democracy. So I work at Carnegie-Mellon University. It's a well-known tech school, right? So in computer softwares, when there's a bug, right, it means that the software doesn't work, or something is preventing the software from being as efficient as possible. So what I mean by bugs in democracy is these are the things in our democracy that makes our votes worth less than other people's votes, or that create distortions in representation. So a bug in software breaks code, a bug in democracy breaks representation, okay? So the way I'm defining bugs here, there's lots of instances, small, the slides are kind of unimportant here, but you know, kind of listing out things that came to my mind throughout US history that I would classify as bugs. Things like restrictions to the franchise, right? Property requirements for voting, literacy test for voting, voter ID laws, campaign finance, election subversion, the Electoral College. And so I'm going to try to hit most of these, okay? Most of them very, very quickly, okay? So before I get there, I want to focus on one, just a quote, just because it's like my favorite quote you may never have heard before. And I just love this slide. So very famously, Ben Franklin, okay, so lived a time when a lot of states had enacted laws that that required you to own some kind of property to vote. So he says, and property could be defined as, depending on where you lived, as like a homestead or a farm. It could be livestock. And so here he says, today a man owns a jackass worth $50 and he is entitled to vote. But before the next election, the jackass dies. The man, in the meantime, has become more experienced. His knowledge of principles of government and his acquaintance with mankind are more extensive, and he is therefore better qualified to make proper selection of his rulers. But the jackass is dead, and the man cannot vote. Now, gentlemen, pray inform me, with whom is the right of suffrage? In the man or in the jackass? Right? So we don't have property requirements any longer for voting. In my list here, right, a lot of these things are gone. 3/5 clause, gone, replaced in the 14th Amendment. 19th Amendment gave women suffrage, women have the right to vote. Jim Crow laws were eliminated in the 1960s, right? So we can sort of pass through some of these because they're not relevant to today. Although it's good, especially for my students, to understand the history, right? To understand where we're coming from, to see where we're going. So going through the remaining list, I'm going to go through most of these with one slide very quickly with not a lot of commentary, because I don't feel quite expert enough to speak about some of these things. So one bug in our democracy is campaign finance. There's a lot of money in our system. The plot here on the right shows up until 2024, right, the amount of money in billions. It's very, very small. Basically, right here is 15 billion, right here is 20 billion, and you can see it's increasing over time. And there's a lot of money being spent in our elections. A very famous political scientist wrote in the book, The Semi-Sovereign People, the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent, right? Right. So of course everybody's supposed to be the same level, right? And in our democracy, those with more money speak more loudly than those with less money. All right. So, is this a problem? I think it is a bug in democracy. Okay. So another type of bug is spoiled ballots. And I bring this up without a lot of detail because I think it's a really important sort of under-talked about problem in our democracy, right? So when we go to the ballot box and we cast our ballot, we assume it's being counted accurately. This may or may not be the case, and in some cases it's hard to know, right? And I don't know how you all vote here in West Virginia. I vote in Pennsylvania, and I have a Scantron, and you fill in a circle, right? I know as a professor, right, when we've done Scantrons, it's susceptible to error, right? If we don't mark it exactly correctly, it might not count exactly correctly. So you might get a spoiled or rejected ballot, or a ballot is not counted correctly. If you see in the background, the picture there is from the 2000 election, right? Very famously, a lot of ballots were not counted accurately in Florida, right? And had the effect of deciding which candidate was going to be the president, right? And which candidate was not. So again, like, we don't think about these things as often, but certainly the kind of technology that we use in our democracy can have a distorting effect. Sometimes minor, sometimes less minor, right? So I didn't grab the data, but I know in Pennsylvania that there was a study done by the Philadelphia Inquirer that showed that older people were much more likely to have their vote not counted than younger people, right? And it was a kind of a staggering percentage of people that did not have their vote counted. Just didn't have it counted because of some kind of error. Because there's a lot of technicalities, particularly with mail-in ballots. In Pennsylvania, you have to sign it, you have to put a date on it, and it has to be put in an envelope exactly correctly. Otherwise, it's susceptible to not being counted, right? And so these are the kinds of things I think we should be aware of and thinking about, though they're sort of hidden in our democracy in some ways. Election administration is not what we call a sexy topic, okay? All right. So another one, voter ID laws. I'm not going to say a whole lot here because some people think of voter ID laws as a type of suppression. But what I will say is that when you ask the public if they want to have voter ID laws, there's overwhelming support to have this kind of law put in place among both Democrats and Republicans. 81% of Americans think that we should have voter ID laws. Right? So they actually are quite popular. And you can think about it in two ways. A voter ID law might be a suppression method, but it also might be a method to protect your vote, right? So we can think about it in two ways. From my perspective, not to be too much opinionated here, but I think that we can have voter ID laws without it being suppression, right? By ensuring everybody is entitled to have access to an ID without cost, right? So we can do these things. We can have it both ways. And the plot on the right shows the states that have enacted strict voter ID laws, disproportionately southern states. The darker the hexagons are, the more strict the voter ID law is. So some states have strict non-photo ID laws, so those are the sort of darker gray ones. Those would be like states that might allow you to bring your college ID or your gun ID or whatever kind of ID that has your photo on it, but maybe not a driver's license. Okay, election subversion. I'm not going to say much about this other than to point you to a paper that I have published on election subversion in the 2020 election. The paper that we published basically counters the claims that the 2020 election was stolen by showing how data was misused and misrepresented But the effect of election subversion to basically deny that the candidate won is so fundamentally wrong to democracy that I mean, we could go on for ages about this, right? It's not even a little bug. This would be catastrophe. Okay. Now we're going to get to the part of the presentation, right? So I want to fly through that stuff. I don't feel sufficiently expert in most of those categories to spend a lot of time. But now we're going to get into a class of bugs that I call anti-majoritarianism. And so what I mean here is that it's when the minority gets their way and the majority doesn't get their way. In some ways, counterintuitive to actual democracy. So we'll start with the US Senate. Okay. And the history of the US Senate, right, you probably well know if you've taken civics class, which, by the way, a lot of the students have not taken basic civics classes yet. Big problem, right, for the future of our democracy, that we educate our young people about these things. But so we're familiar with the Great Compromise, right? Our country was founded on this compromise that gave some voters a larger stake in our democracy than other voters. I know it's a little small, but the numbers don't matter here. But the basic point is that you can think about malapportionment in the Senate and how it has a distorting effect in a number of different ways. But one way that's really easy to sort of think about is the ratio of the largest state and the smallest state, right? And then what I'm showing here is that over time, and that's the actual important point that I want to make. The Senate has always been anti-majoritarian, right? It was founded that way. Every state is going to be entitled to 2 senators regardless of their population. But the magnitude of that distortion has increased over time, right? So we are more unequal today than we were at the founding, and by a lot. Okay, so the smallest state in 1790, the first census, was a little under 30,000 people, and the largest state was a little under 400,000 people. So the ratio was 12.65. So you divide the largest by the smallest, okay? Today, the largest state, California, has almost 40 million people in it, and the smallest state, Wyoming, has not even 600,000 people in it. All right, and we can also go into the fact that Washington, D.C. has no representation, and they have over 600,000 people in it, right? They get no representation. So we'll leave that aside for the moment. And you can see it's a little bit stabilized in the last couple of decades, but still nonetheless, it's monotonically going up, right? So less representation for those who live in large states than those who live in small states. Okay, Electoral College. So you're all familiar with the fact that in 5 instances in American history, the winner of the popular vote failed to win the presidency. So that itself is a type of anti-majoritarian outcome, right? The majority did not get their way, right? So I wrote my dissertation on the Electoral College, and I sort of analyzed a lot of data involving the Electoral College. And the basic question that I'm interested in is, how biased is the Electoral College? Is it so biased as to be an institution worth scrapping? So now, the Electoral College, the EC, is not perfect. The founders understood it not to be perfect. And in fact, if you read the history of the Constitutional Convention, the Electoral College was left to this committee of leftovers, right? It was a long, hot summer in Philadelphia with no air conditioning, and they were tired, and they had almost everything agreed upon except how to elect the executive. And they basically just said, we give up, right? We'll just do that number of people in the House plus the number of people in the Senate. It's Electoral College. So I analyzed in this paper, in a chapter in my dissertation, 8 or 9 different alternatives to electing the president besides the Electoral College vote. So trying to imagine allowing to keep the state sovereignty, right? We want to keep the states having some independent voice in our democracy, but without going to a direct popular vote. And it turns out that no matter how you do this, it's always susceptible to these, what we call inversions, right? Where the popular vote winner doesn't win the election. So the only way to prevent that is to use a direct popular vote. there are ways to, like, if you could imagine, instead of having electors who are real individuals, these are real people, like, that are electors, they're whole people. If you could split people into fractions, you can get much closer to the popular vote while maintaining state sovereignty. But we'd have to change the Constitution to undo this part of our democracy. And I would argue that switching to a direct popular vote would have its own negative consequences, particularly in the hyper-polarized world that we live in, right? Where you can imagine that if the popular vote is close, which it has tended to be over the last several decades, and if we were to change our system to a direct popular vote, probably would be even more close, that you would have so many challenges to basically every vote. Remember we talked about earlier, whether you mark the ballot exactly right. You can imagine a situation where every single ballot is scrutinized, and we would never emerge from litigation in some of these instances. So it's not necessarily a better thing, right? I'm not defending the Electoral College. I'm just saying that there are challenges to other sorts of electoral systems that keep the executive separate from the legislature. Okay, so is the Electoral College biased? I ran simulations based on actual election results. It's a published paper in Presidential Studies Quarterly, trying to estimate the magnitude of partisan bias. So we took each election and simulated it out millions of times at different vote shares to see whether bias existed in the system. The important thing to kind of notice is majoritarian principle, right? When the party that wins the most votes ought to win the most seats, right? And so if you're over 50% of the vote, you should be over 50% of the seats. Seats here are Electoral College members. And you'll see, right, in the 2016 election and the 2020 election, the line for Biden and Clinton, the Democrat, go into this territory here, which is an anti-majoritarian outcome. So these elections were biased, right? The Electoral College is currently biased against Democrats. But in the first plot, I show the 2000 election. And the lines for the two parties go almost directly through 50-50, suggesting no partisan bias in the Electoral College. And what you see over the course of American history is that there is always some bias in the Electoral College. It's basically impossible not to have any. It never consistently favors one party or the other. I haven't done 2024 yet, but almost certainly the bias has been reduced, right? Because the patterns of voting behavior have changed. And so there is some bias, but it tends to ebb and flow over time, and there's a good probability that it will go back towards favoring the Democrats at some point. And by the way, Trump won the majority of the vote, the popular vote. So it wasn't an anti-majoritarian outcome, even if there was some bias. Okay, so I have this slide. It wasn't on the original, but on the original list. But the Supreme Court also has some of these bugs, in a sense, because the president is the one who appoints the Supreme Court justices, and the Senate is the one who confirms them. And both of those elections involve extreme bias, or some bias, right? So inevitably, the Supreme Court is not an election, but results from elections that have distorted effects. And at least if my list is correct here, right, I listed it in two categories. One, where the president won the popular vote, and the other, where the president did not win the popular vote, right? 4 of the 9 justices were nominated by presidents who did not win the popular vote. So they did not have a popular vote mandate, right? And if we were to look at the Senate, right, we also know that Democrats regularly get far more votes than Republicans in the Senate elections, and yet don't have majorities often that allow this outcome to happen because of those distortions, right? So I think this is a really important point, right? And, by the way, the Democrats, because there's never been an electoral inversion that has favored Republican or favored Democrats, the Democrats are always nominating from the president who won the popular vote. But I think it's an important point, underreported, but important nonetheless. This is, in some ways, Supreme Court justices are nominated by historical accident of when people happen to die, right, with no rhyme or reason. Trump in his first term, 4 years, got 3 justices on the Supreme Court, lifetime appointments. Biden, same 4-year term, 1, right? Obama, 8 years, what did he get, 2? Or 2 or 3 maybe? In 8 years, really, drastic differences, but all by historic accident. So this is another, I think, critically important book. So now the big one, or at least my big one, the one I studied, gerrymandering, right? And so I have a lot to say about gerrymandering, and in some ways I don't want to use the slides too much. There's stuff going on. As I was driving here, I got an alert that Missouri passed a new congressional map today, right? It's not in the presentation, but things are evolving quickly. When Rich first asked me to be a speaker here, I go, nobody wants to hear about gerrymandering, right? It's 2025, right? We're not doing redistricting until 2030. And then like 2 months ago, a month and a half ago, all of a sudden, it's just blown up. I'm supposed to be on my paternity leave, summer break, and here I am, busy as I've ever been, unexpectedly. And this week was maybe the busiest week of my life, right? I've already gotten calls about what's going on in Missouri, and I get reporters calling me constantly. Okay, so let's kind of go through both some history, some background, and then a little bit about what's going on right now. All right, so history. Apportionment. Apportionment, as I told my students this week, is really important. And why is it really important? Because it's in the US Constitution, right? The US Constitution says that we must apportion the House of Representatives and the Electoral College, right, according to the population. We count the population every 10 years. We get new figures that dictate how much representation each state gets. Like West Virginia lost a congressional district in 2020. These are really important for the distribution of power, which ultimately is important for redistricting and gerrymandering. So, fun fact, the first ever presidential veto was about apportionment, right? And it turns out that apportionment, this like sort of boring subject maybe, like it's this mathematical thing, is actually extremely political. Because exactly how you decide how to take fractions into whole numbers can affect the amount of representation, sometimes by a lot, that big states and small states get. And so George Washington did not like the method that Congress passed in the first, for the first census, vetoed it, and they picked a different method. Throughout American history, there was 5 different methods used to apportion the House of Representatives. And they have differences in outcomes. So that's just like another way that you can potentially be distorted. Okay, malapportionment. So we have apportionment, we have malapportionment. Historically, gerrymandering has been done not through the drawing of lines per se, but instead by the number of people in each district, right? And you can think about this in the same way as the US Senate, right? There's different numbers of people in the US Senate, and they each get the same, each state gets the same amount of representation. If you did that with congressional districts, you might have a district that is, say, I'm trying to get a good example here. Well, let's just say Mon County, right, gets its own, but so does Preston County, gets its own representative as well. That would be unfair, because it's unequal, right? There's more people in Mon County than there are in Preston County. But this is how historically redistricting has been done, right? And so it goes back to apportionment. At the beginning of American history, right, the states were all smaller and the number of districts were smaller. And every 10 years, as they would count the population, we would just add more districts so that no state would ever lose a seat. So what happened in West Virginia in 2020 never would have happened prior to 1920, right? They always would just add more seats so that no states would lose. Most states wouldn't change, right? Most states don't change from a decade to decade basis. They keep the same number of districts, right? And if you don't get more districts, it means you don't have to redistrict. At least that's how it's operated through all of American history into the 1960s. So apportionment, again, has been really a battle. After 1920, Congress refused to reapportion because rural areas had less people in it than urban areas for the first time in American history. And so Congress did not want to lose representation for rural areas, so they refused to apportion. In 1929, they had the Permanent Reapportion Act that set the House of Representatives at 435. That's where we are today. And now, so states now lose since that time. All right, so this is how it's happened in the past. And this manifested in a real way. In 1960s, there's a series of important court cases that led to the principle of one person, one vote, which I'm sure you've heard of. Right, and it stems from a case, Baker versus Carr, and it was situated in Tennessee, where one district had 100 times more people in it than another district. Right, extremely unequal. Right, but after the 1960s, they ended this. They said one person, one vote. Trees don't vote, people vote. Right, that's kind of the quote from Earl Warren. Not that funny, Jake. All right, so partisan gerrymandering. So there's a long American history of partisan gerrymandering. This is the original salamander, right? So the salamander was a redistricting plan in Massachusetts in 1812 that Elbridge Gerry, one of the founding fathers, presided over as governor. Now, he didn't actually draw the map, but he was governor and he approved the map. And a newspaper then sketched it out, right, all these counties put together, and said, that looks like a salamander. That's Elbridge Gerry's salamander. That's gerrymander. So 1812, right? This is old, not new. Okay, so what is partisan gerrymandering? So here's a definition. This definition I'm going to go with. Manipulating electoral district boundaries to favor one party or one group. Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a political party. Right? It could be a racial group. Right? You can discriminate against a racial group. You could discriminate against MICA. Right? If it was possible. Right? You could do any kind of group.
Or just too big.
Too big. You got a cracky. There's kind of two main ways to partisan gerrymander. There's packing, which is concentrating the opposition voters into as few districts as possible. I'm going to show you a little bit of this. And then there's cracking, which is spreading the opposition voters out thinly to dilute their power. So some people, if you ask them what gerrymandering is, they're not going to tell you this. Right? They're going to say it's funny shapes on a map. Right? This is a funny shape. This is Goofy kicking Donald Duck. Y'all are from West Virginia, not from Pennsylvania. This is Pennsylvania in the previous decade, okay? This actually is a partisan gerrymander, so it's not a perfect example of when shapes don't matter. This actually was an intended partisan gerrymander. This map was overturned by the state court. Okay, we're good. We're good. Safe. But this is District 7 is fragmented across 5 different counties. No one county is wholly within one district. And some of the thin strips there are like parking lots for like a steakhouse, like literally. Okay, so this was actually an egregious partisan gerrymander in this case. But, yeah, I cried about this one too. Okay. Now it's hard to know when I'm on my computer like this, like everything looks great big and clear. I'm going to describe to you, so this is not gerrymandering per se. It might be, it's an indication, right? Like if you see this, I told a judge earlier this year that like when you see something like that as a map maker or as somebody who analyzes districting plans, I say, I want to know what's going on here. I'm not going to immediately say it's a gerrymander. I'm going to say something's going on here. What as a social scientist I actually care about is how votes translates into seats from a democracy standpoint, right? We care about majoritarianism. We care that when 50% of the voters want something, that they get something. And that those who don't represent a majority don't get the majority of the pie, right? So it's a fairness thing. That's how it's conceived. What's really important is that election results are in 2 quadrants on the graph, right? They're in upper right or the lower left. these are the areas where you have majoritarian rule, right? With 50% of the vote, you get 50% of the seats. With 60% of the vote, you get more than 50% of the seats. The real question, though, and this is what has really hung up the US Supreme Court, is how should votes translate into seats? A lot of people say, if I get 60% of the votes, my party, I ought to get 60% of the seats. But single-member districts, as we have situated our democracy, don't naturally lend themselves to proportional representation, right? You need a different electoral system if you want that outcome. And so instead, what we get is what might be referred to as a winner's bonus, right? So, for instance, in the Electoral College, President Trump only won a little bit more than 50% of the votes. But he won a lot more than 50% of the electors. That's the winner's bonus. That's a very natural outcome, right? That's the way our system is designed, almost intentionally, right? We want the winners to have a clear mandate. The question is at what percentage of the vote is it no longer fair, right? And so all of these lines, these three lines, all represent fair outcomes. Anything that would end up in the other quadrants are not. And I know it's a little technical, and I don't want to get into the details of it, but this plot, I think, does a really nice job of showing throughout American history, from 1946 to 2010, the black dots are the actual election results in the House of Representatives. On the x-axis is the votes, with Republicans being on the one end and Democrats being on the right end. And then seats is on the y-axis. Okay, and it's exactly the pattern you expect, right? When you get more votes, you get more seats. Democracy, right? Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. And historically, the House of Representatives has been within margins, pretty democratic, small d democratic. But what you see is in 2012, in 2014, in 2016, in 2018, that red line shows very anti-democratic outcomes. This is a result of gerrymandering, right? Republicans had, now I'm being a little political, but this is the facts, right? So prior to 2010, Republicans spent a lot of resources winning state legislative elections, so they controlled the majority of state legislatures. After 2010 census, they redid the maps in a way that benefited them to the point where it created this huge distortion in the seat outcomes. So even though the Democrats won a majority of the votes in 2012, they did not win a majority of the seats. They were the minority party. Right, so that would have been Obama's first year of his second term. Anti-majoritarianism. So that's exactly how it manifests in real life, these seats votes curves. You expect it to be in those two quadrants, and when it's not, you got to be concerned. By the way, 2020 is marked with an X. It goes back to a historical average. That's because state courts had stepped in to police partisan gerrymandering in several states, including Pennsylvania. They got rid of that goofy kicking Donald Duck district, okay? So it went to a more fair outcome. In 2019, the US Supreme Court, now we're getting to a little bit more current events, okay? The US Supreme Court said it's too hard to measure gerrymandering, right? We don't have the right toolkit for measuring gerrymandering. We do. Okay. But they said we don't. We can't do it. And they said it's beyond the purview of federal courts to dictate how much political activity states should have. That it's ultimately political, it's a political decision, and the courts can't be involved in politics. So they said, they washed their hands. John Roberts wrote the majority opinion. He uses all these fancy terms like, oh, your concerns don't echo into the void. That's a quote. But we're not going to do anything, right? But we're not going to do anything. Right? We don't endorse partisan gerrymandering. Quote. But we're not going to do anything. Okay. So after the 2020 cycle, these are grades put together by my collaborator, Sam Wong, at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, using different methodologies and using different aspects of districting plans and simulating for each state 1 million different hypothetical outcomes and then comparing them to the plans that were passed. These are the states that get failing grades. They're red not because they're Republican, by the way. They're red because they're Carnegie-Mellon. That's Carnegie-Mellon. Okay. It turns out that all but 4 of them are Republican states. The only ones that are not are Oregon, Nevada, New Mexico, and Illinois. The rest of them are states that were controlled by Republicans. Okay. I'm going to go through this really quickly. So imagine you have a state where you have 20 voters, and you have 4 districts. So you have to draw districts that have 5 people in them. How are we going to do it? All right. So let's say we just draw straight lines through these. It's a reasonable thing, right? That's compact, right? That's not a funny shape. That's reasonable. Let's do that. Or let's do this. Let's just take like the circles, the people that are closest to each other. We'll group them together. These are fair plans, right? What if I told you that the blue dots were the Democrats and that they represent 30% of the voters? You do it this way, right? 3 black, 1 blue. 3 black, 2 blue. 3 black, 2 blue. 4 black, 1 blue. Right? Democrats lose all of the districts, even though they have 30% of the votes. Is it fair? I don't know, right? They're straight lines. Same thing here, right? Exactly the same outcome, right? Democrats win 0. So partisan gerrymanderers, people who do this, right, use their knowledge of voter preferences and their ability to draw favorable redistricting plans to maximize their party's vote share. Okay, now you can love me a little bit more. So this may or may not result in distorted shapes, right? Knowing where people live and using that to weaponize it against people has nothing to do with shape, right? It has to do with a manipulation that is more sinister. Oh, and we gave it a name in one of my papers that has been picked up in steam. Hopefully the Supreme Court will overturn their own precedent at some point. She didn't want me. We call it stealth gerrymandering. It's when you gerrymander it, it's hard to tell just by looking at it. So let me give you a concrete example. The map on the left is a map that was produced by the North Carolina Supreme Court. Actually, it was drawn by my mentor. Yes, my mentor drew the map. On the right is a map that was a mid-decade redistricting that the media did not report on. Right? So I got so many media press inquiries over the summer. I don't think I got one in 2023 when North Carolina did a mid-decade redistricting, but they did. And from these two, I mean, I know it's hard to see, but you can't really see anything that seems egregious, really, right? So these are just shapes on a map. They all have kind of squiggly lines, but one was drawn by a court and one was drawn by the legislature. Now let's draw the political outcomes on these maps. So the map on the left, drawn by my mentor, right, has eight Republicans won on this map versus 6 Democrats. Now, North Carolina, if you know anything about North Carolina, is a 50-50 state with a little bit of a slight Republican lean. Democrats do win statewide. The governor is a Democrat right now. The former governor was a Democrat. But Trump has won in North Carolina, I think, in all 3 of his elections. So it's sort of a purplish state with a slight red Republican lean. So 8 Republican victories and 6 Democratic victories seems fair. In the redraw, right, Republicans redrew it so that they have 11 seats in which they win and Democrats 3. That's a 3-seat flip, right? This is the same election, right? So what you're seeing is projecting election results into the district, same election. But the outcome are different, and that's because the district lines matter, right? How you draw the lines affects representation. This is a bug in our democracy, a big bug, big cockroach bug. Okay, so West Virginia, I had to give you guys something here. So West Virginia is about 30% of the voters are Democrat. That's not nothing, it used to be a lot more. Proportionately, that would be about 0.6 districts out of 2. Not a lot. So you can redraw the line. There's only one line now because there's only 2 districts. You can draw in lots of different ways. But they all lead to the same outcome in West Virginia. Somebody drew 5,000 potential plans for West Virginia, and every single one of them resulted in 2 Republicans and no Democrats. No goodie. That's less than proportional, right? As I mentioned to you earlier, proportional is not the expectation here, right? But if you were to concentrate all the Democrats, say in Morgantown, right? Every Democrat, if they lived in Morgantown, you actually could draw a district around Morgantown where the Democrats would be a majority of the district, right? And they don't, because as we saw on the map here, right, Democrats are in the suburbs of DC. They're in, you can see, I can see all you guys right there. And then down the so you have to put them all in one area because we have single-member districts, and that means contiguous districts. They have to be together. Okay. Don't go there yet. I'll go there. The last thing I say here is, so in Utah, I think last week or the week before, a court in Utah has struck down the congressional district plan in Utah as a partisan gerrymander. In Utah, almost all the Democrats live in Salt Lake City, right? So that example I just gave about Morgantown actually works in Utah. So what the legislature did in Utah is that they divided Salt Lake City into 4 different districts. They took the Democrats and put a quarter of the Democrats in one, a quarter in another, a quarter in another, a quarter in another, and that way they have no power. Okay, but you draw a district around Salt Lake City, and Democrats will elect one member to their one out of 4. And so the court has struck that down, and we'll see where it goes. It's still in litigation, and there's no outcome. But they told the legislature they need to redo it. So that's the situation. Though we can think about whether Democrats actually deserve to have representation in Utah if it meant that all the Democrats had to live in one area. We have to think of really, like, we're not going to do like a break into small groups and discuss kind of thing, but we have to really think about what our connotations of democracy and representation are to understand whether that is or is not a partisan gerrymandering. But I'm not going to get into that. What I want to get into is this guy saying that we meaning Republicans, are entitled to 5 more seats. You guys heard this quote?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're entitled, wow, entitled. I had to get out my dictionary to figure out what entitled means, but I'm not sure anybody's entitled to anything in democracy. I think you have to win votes. But let me give you a quick background on Texas. Because now we're into really current events. Okay. So Texas is one of the fastest growing states in the country, and it's growing quickly with people of color. And it's not growing so quickly with people that are white. And before the 2020 census, estimates estimated that through apportionment, Texas was going to gain 3 seats. But the first Trump administration threatened to put a citizenship question on the US Census. For reasons that they said were so they could better adhere to the Voting Rights Act. That actually got struck down by the US Supreme Court, and John Roberts in the majority opinion said that was a pretextual reason. The actual reason, they're not going to actually say, but probably so that they could enforce deportation. And also because there was a sense that if they could scare Hispanics from answering the census, that it would benefit Republicans in terms of apportionment. It actually may have backfired because Texas only gained 2 seats because of their large Hispanic population who had the largest undercount of any group. They were undercounted by about 5% in the US Census. The growth in Texas was from minorities, 100%. So those 2 new districts probably should have gone to be majority minority districts. But guess what happened? They were both majority white. Not surprising. This is probably a violation of the Voting Rights Act. And in May of this year, plaintiffs had trial saying that it was a violation of the Voting Rights Act. That trial was basically concluded and was likely to overturn the last map in Texas. So why did Texas do a redistricting? Well, part of it was because Donald Trump said we want 5 more seats. Part of it was probably because they were getting sued and they wanted to undercut that lawsuit. And so that lawsuit is still pending, and they're now going to look at the new map, which is a good thing, right? And they're going to ask whether this new map violates the Voting Rights Act. So on the left is the map that was enacted after the census, and on the right is the map that was enacted just last month, or earlier this month, with the precincts colored. You can see, like much of the country, Democrats are clustered in urban areas, and Republicans are scattered more through the rural areas. And this has created a geographic disadvantage, a bug, you might say, that makes it a lot easier for Republicans to gerrymander than it does for Democrats. The new map, which is the one with the black outline, is very similar to the old map in most of the different ways we might measure gerrymandering, except for what they call proportionality, or what I might just call the number of seats that are expected to be won by Republicans, or by Democrats. So fewer seats expected to be won by Democrats. Okay. Political situation. About 46% of the voters in Texas are Democrats. It's a lot more than West Virginia, actually, right? It's pretty close to 50-50. Proportionally, that would translate to almost 18 seats. Roughly speaking, with my little seats votes curve that I showed you and using sort of traditional measures of partisan bias that political scientists use, we might expect Democrats to win between 14 and 16 seats. That group of researchers did 5,000 random simulated maps of Texas without taking partisanship into account. The Democrats won somewhere between 15 and 19 seats on average, with 17 being the most typical. Under the old map, Democrats were usually able to win 13 seats. Under the newly passed map, 9.7. So Democrats have lost through redistricting 3.3 seats on average. That's my calculations. Okay, what are we doing on time? We're doing okay, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm actually kind of getting close. So this is, I know I'm talking a little fast, but I do want to get through stuff so we can maybe do Q&A or something. All right, so I'm going to ask you a question about two different districts and ask for your opinion on which one is more gerrymandered. Okay, so this is District 29. This is Texas. If you really zoom in, you'll see that this is George Bush Intercontinental Airport, Houston. Okay, so this is Houston. So this is the district, 17.7% white, 43.4% Hispanic, 33.6% black, 4.4% Asian. Okay, District 18. Now, this is the same area, all right? So here's the airport. This district kind of circles around the city of Houston. There they are next to each other. So which one is more gerrymandered? The one on the left or the one on the right? And you might anticipate my answer when I said that shapes don't necessarily matter. Right? The one on the left is really egregious looking. And the one on the right looks kind of reasonable. But the one on the right is the new map. And if you look real closely at the numbers that I showed, the percentage white went down, which means the percentage non-white went up. Why might they have done that? Right? White voters are disproportionately Republican, and minority voters are disproportionately Democrats. This is a packed district. They took a district, the one on the left, that already was electing minority candidates, and they made it more packed. Not necessary, definitely not necessary for the Voting Rights Act, probably a violation of the Voting Rights Act. And they did it by suggesting that the district on the left was unconstitutional. It gets really technical and ridiculous, but the Department of Justice sent a letter to Texas saying that this district was unconstitutional because it was a coalition district where it was drawn so that Hispanic, Black, and Asian voters could join together to elect candidates of their choice, and that's unconstitutional, which is absolutely absurd, right? It's wrong on every level, and of course this is also a coalition district. It's just a more packed coalition district. And by total voters and voting age voters, there's actually majority Hispanic in this district on the right, which they're saying is consistent with the Voting Rights Act. This is the Trump administration, Department of Justice, changing the definitions of the Voting Rights Act. in my view, purposely, because they want it to be litigated to go to the US Supreme Court so they can get rid of the Voting Rights Act altogether. I'll come to that. So here's the effect of the map. This is the original data analysis I did this week. So the bar on the left is the old map in Texas, the bar on the right is the new map. Across 7 different elections, so this is elections from 2016 to 2024, all statewide elections projected into the district boundaries under the old map and the new map. You see a consistent reduction of at least 2 districts for Democrats. Democrats are winning 2 less no matter what. On average, it's less, it's more than 3, and in the most recent elections, it's 4 or 5. This is what Donald Trump asked. I'm entitled to 5 more districts. This was the ask. They succeeded. At the beginning of the whole process, I and other people said, this is not possible. This map is already gerrymandered. I just demonstrated this map was already gerrymandered. Right? That really weird district around Houston, they didn't need to draw the district that way. They had to draw that district that way to comply with the Voting Rights Act and draw a political gerrymander. They could have drawn something much more neutral, much more square or circle-like, and still complied with the Voting Rights Act, but they wouldn't have been able to political gerrymander. Right? So they were already a gerrymander. Now it's a really egregious gerrymander. How do you do that? How you do that is you get rid of the Voting Rights Act districts. They decimated the existing Voting Rights Act districts, right? So the new PAC district is still majority-minority, but one of the other majority-minority districts in Houston, gone. And one in Dallas, gone, right? So they're picking a fight because they have purposely discriminated against minorities, right, in order to achieve a partisan gerrymander. And they knew that they were doing this, right? And they knew they're going to get sued. They're already been sued, right? They want that fight because they want to overturn the Voting Rights Act. All right, so just a little background on the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, and you guys probably know this, but I'll still say it, especially as it relates to redistricting. So the Voting Rights Act prohibits vote dilution for protected minorities. Okay, protected minorities has a definition in the law. Right, it's people who have been a class of individuals who have a history of discrimination and that vote as a bloc. And the majority votes against them regularly. Right, so all these things combined. Right, that's how you become a protected minority. And in the United States, the protected minorities in most places are blacks, Asians, and Hispanics. In terms of redistricting, a state cannot enact a law or draw a map that is intended or has the effect of preventing protected minority populations equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. They definitely did that in Texas, right? 100% have done that. The previous map was already a violation of the Voting Rights Act. The new map does nothing to fix those existing Voting Rights Act violations and perpetuated them further. So you ask, they ask, I ask, what effect has the Voting Rights Act had on majority-minority representation, minority representation? So this is a plot through from 1870 to 2020. And you'll see, actually in the late 1800s, there were some blacks who were able to get elected to Congress. Not very many, but some in the South, including one senator for 3 terms. And then right here, you see no representation for African Americans in the United States, in Congress, 0. No blacks were elected to Congress for decades. Jim Crow, that's Jim Crow. And then you get 1 or 2, right? I don't remember who it is, maybe Shirley Chisholm or something in New York, not the South, right? You know, maybe New York City or something. So you get a couple, and then the dotted line is where the Voting Rights Act is passed. And look at that. This is called discontinuity, right? Something changes, right, the law, and then something else changes, the number of majority-minority seats. The Voting Rights Act is the most important piece of legislation in American history. There, I said it. That's my take on it, right? That is my line. I say it to every reporter who will ask me, right? Nobody will ever put me in print on it. I want to be on the record, right? It's the most important piece of legislation ever passed by Congress. And then what you see in the dark black line, I put that, there's no law that changed there, but there was a really important court case, Jingle versus Thorngood. My mentor was the expert witness in that case, developing a vote dilution test. It's at that point, and actually after the 1982 renewal of the Voting Rights Act, where they added the word "or effect." Right, so it's not just that a legislature has to intend to discriminate. Right? I think that they might be able to prove that Texas intended to discriminate. But the law only requires the effect. It doesn't require anybody to prove intent. Right, and after that, you get after the U.S. Supreme Court rules that that law is constitutional, you get a drastic increase. Because now states are forced to draw these majority-minority districts by law. Because the Supreme Court is going to, strike down your plan and replace it with their own if you don't. So you get distracted. The Voting Rights Act clearly works, right? It's clearly working to increase minority representation. Okay, back to my example, right? Now imagine that those Democrats are all black voters. They're not just Democrats, they're black Democrats, right? This is different now, according to the law. Before, when they were Democrats, you can legally pass this unless you have state laws that prohibit it. But from a federal level, completely legal after Rucho versus Common Cause. Also completely legal. Right? At the very bottom there. Violates the VRA. This is a violation of the Voting Rights Act. Black voters are not given an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice under this map, right? Because they don't win any elections. So what does the VRA compel somebody to do in this case? It compels them to draw that district, or that district, or that district, right? There's lots of examples of districts, and I didn't even get to all of them, right, that are contiguous and acceptable in every other way for this example. That comply with the Voting Rights Act. So what happens if black voters are more dispersed, right? They're not as concentrated. Does the state still have to draw something like this? I eliminated one black Democrat from this example just to make it work. I should come up with a better toy example at some point. Well, that's the big question, right? So in the 1990s, legislatures used to enact districts that look like this. This is an actual district from North Carolina in 1992. This is a black majority district. It strings together black voters from all parts. This was enacted by Democrats, by the way, in order to increase Democratic representation. The court struck this down, and they said in this really important court case that race cannot predominate in the drawing of districts. So you can't, basically, the 14th Amendment prohibits discrimination against racial minorities. And this is a way of discriminating by predominating race in redistricting. So there's the Shaw versus Reno. Reno is Janet Reno, Attorney General at the time. And Senator Dan O'Connor says that a district that is so bizarre in its face that it is unexplainable on grounds other than race is unconstitutional. All right, now we're really getting very, very, very current. So in the last redistricting, after the 2020 census, the state of Louisiana enacted a map that had one black district. Blacks are 31% of the population in Louisiana. And Louisiana has 6 districts. So if you draw one black district out of 6, it's 16%. Right, that's a lot less than 31% of the population. If you draw 2, it's 33%, which is a lot closer to the 31% of the population. The court struck down this plan, and they said you must draw 2 districts under the Voting Rights Act. There's a lot of proof that a plaintiff must show in order to have a court overturn it. Okay, a lot that has to be done to show this, and they demonstrated it all. The state of Louisiana complied with the court order because they said, and this is, by the way, right after I redrew the map in New York, they said we don't want for a court. I redrew the map in New York for a court. They said we don't want the court to redraw the map because the court might pair incumbents, right? And so I got a lot of heat from Democrats in New York for pairing incumbents. Courts don't care about incumbents. They don't, right? They care about complying with the law, right? And so they said, well, we don't want that to happen to us. So we're just going to comply with the court order. And we're going to draw 2 black districts. So they did. They passed the map with 2 black districts. So So the map there on the left is the original map that got struck down. It had only one black district. The map on the right is the new map. The map that is currently the law in Louisiana. 2 black districts. Completely complies with the law. Court said, okay, that's fine. Now, that's not the only kind of map. Lots of maps can be drawn that comply with the Voting Rights Act in Louisiana. You can draw something like this, right? That's much more compact than this on the right there. Right? You could have drawn that. There are rivers. The Mississippi River goes through Louisiana, gives it swigglies. Again, swiggly lines is not indicative of anything. But you could have drawn this. They didn't draw it. They drew that. They didn't draw that. Okay, fast forward. So they passed this map. A group of self-defined non-black Republican voters sued, claiming the map was a racial gerrymander, right? Like predominating race. The state countered, right? The state of Louisiana said this was motivated by partisan goals. And in Rucho versus Common Cause, you said we can draw a partisan gerrymander. So that's what we did. They wanted to, so a little bit of background. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, is from Louisiana. Steve Scalise, Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, is from Louisiana. And somebody else who I have no idea of their name, so sorry to them, is like a powerful committee, like Ways and Means Committee chairperson. And they would have been affected. One of them would have lost had they drawn that map. Right? So if the court had enacted a map of their own, one of them would have been out. And they didn't want that. So they did it for partisan goals. The federal court agreed with the non-black Republican voters that this was a racial gerrymander. So they struck down the map again. And so it's currently struck down, but it's stayed by the US Supreme Court. It was scheduled to be heard on March 24th earlier this year. I was like waiting for the opinion and set aside the last day of the term to read the damn opinion, right? Because this is important to my work. And the court like put up like on a different page, oh, by the way, we're not going to give an opinion on this case. Because now they want to ask another question. Is the VRA constitutional? And so briefs it's going to be heard on October 15th, a little over a month from today. And briefs are already in. And so I've already read the state of Louisiana's brief. They switched their opinion. They no longer are defending their map. They're saying, we don't want that map. The VRA is unconstitutional. And it's, I don't want to get into it. It's ridiculous. The arguments are pretty insane. The essence of it is, by the way, that a couple of years ago, the US Supreme Court struck down affirmative action. And they say that the VRA is affirmative action for districting. That's the gist of the argument. And that by forcing states to draw a second black district, or any black district, is forcing them to predominate race. Because that's the main thing. Okay. The VRA for redistricting has been in effect since 1986. And just 2 years ago, in a case Allen versus Milligan, the US Supreme Court upheld the law and said it's worked for 40 years the way we initiated it back then. So they rejected the state of Alabama's claim that they didn't have to draw a second district. But now we have all new arguments. The court's actually the same. Nothing's changed on the court, but now we have these new arguments. So what's next, right? So this is what's forthcoming. First of all, Americans want reform to curb gerrymandering. So this is 2020, February 2020. You see that nearly 2/3 support handing electoral map-making powers away from legislatures and towards independent commissions. So the public really wants this. Blue states have enacted lots of reforms, places like New York, which is why I was involved, right? The state of New York tried to pass a partisan gerrymander, but the voters had put prohibitions on partisan gerrymandering into their law. They put independent commission. They didn't want gerrymandering, and so the court struck it down. Initially, in North Carolina, the legislature passed a gerrymander, put a partisan gerrymander. And the state court said, no, that's a violation of our state constitution, right? Which is what I have right there. State constitutions have been interpreted to mean that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Pennsylvania did this too. There's a provision in the Pennsylvania Constitution that dates back to the founding father James Wilson that says that elections must be free and equal. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said partisan gerrymandering necessarily means that the voters are not free and equal. Right? So states have done this. And blue states particularly have done things like California where they taken the power of redistricting completely away from legislators, gave it to private citizens. Michigan, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, a whole bunch of states have done this, right? Have taken it out of the hands of the legislature. Red states have not followed suit, right? So that's why, like, Texas is able to redo their map. That's why Missouri today was able to redo their map because they do not have partisan commissions. Missouri actually does have some state laws that prohibit partisan gerrymandering, so we'll see whether this new map is upheld by the courts or not. But of course, it's like kind of getting late in the game. We're going to have elections pretty soon, and it's hard for courts to have full trials. And other things that we should be on the lookout for, one is states undermining their own laws. So California is attempting to basically undo their own state laws to counteract the effects of the Texas plan. New York is actively looking for ways to undo their laws so they can now redo their map. And other states have talked about doing this as well. My personal take on this is I think it's very dangerous, right? If laws don't matter, right, what principles do we have left to stand on? Good government groups like Common Cause and League of Women Voters, by the way, are split on this. Common Cause has endorsed what's going on in California, and League of Women Voters has refused to endorse it. So just to be on the lookout about, I'm not going to tell anybody how to think about this. I have my own opinions. I think it's dangerous. But it's understandable why voters, Democratic voters in California, might feel like it's an unfair situation where Texas can create a lot of advantage for themselves, and then they're hurt in a national stage by the fact that more Republicans are going to win and potentially have a majority, and they're otherwise handcuffed into fair maps. And so we'll see whether additional states mid-decade redistricting put that, and then of course Missouri does it. So other states are doing mid-decade redistricting. There's other ones that are talking about it, including some blue states. Okay, I'm not going to not show you this slide because I always show my students this slide because, well, a lot of states have now started to adopt the Voting Rights Act at the state level because the federal Voting Rights Act has been depleted in a lot of ways. And like New York has what they call the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, right? Since John Lewis was a fighter for voting rights, as you all know. Don't get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime, right? So I'm optimistic. I think the court's going to rule correctly to uphold the Voting Rights Act. I refuse to be pessimistic about that. A lot of my friends who are involved in this litigation are very skeptical and they're very pessimistic, but I'm not going to be, right? We can't lose hope. That's the only optimistic thing I have to say here. Like, these are bugs in our democracy. They're not good. They're long-standing. But, we can overcome these things. All right, that's it. I'm done.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for that presentation. That was fascinating. I guess my question is, if you were in charge and you could devise a standard algorithm to use to determine how maps are drawn, how districts are drawn, how would it work?
It turns out I have been in charge.
Okay.
Right? Like, I was in charge.
Yeah,
I've been in charge.
Is there like a formula?
We have an algorithm. I don't know if we ever published it, but we have an algorithm. It's not a computer algorithm.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you could program a computer this way, like give it instructions. But yeah, we do have a sort of algorithm, right? So like, in my view, political subdivisions are sacrosanct, right? Like, we should not be dividing people who live in concentrated areas, right? If you live in Mon County, you have things in common with other people in Mon County. Your county shouldn't be divided all over the place in order for partisan advantage. So every state should have, a prohibition on dividing political subdivisions. These are what other people refer to as communities of interest, right? These are long-standing communities, especially counties. Counties have existed, right? The original gerrymander was actually, they didn't fragment counties. They were actually groups of counties put together. It was like the softest gerrymander in the world, right? It was whole counties put together. That's like number one, right? We can do that. And some states have this in their law. So I think it's worthwhile to consider political subdivisions. It limits what people can do, right? We saw Goofy kicking Donald Duck, 5 different counties put in one district when it could have went in no more than 2, right? So that's like number one thing. I think, well, first of all, like we also have to, you have to follow the law as the law exists. So like all districts, like the very first thing, because it's in the US Constitution, as told to us by the US Supreme Court, is all districts have to be of equal size. So no malapportionment, that's like number one. And then decisions have to be made. Of course, this is not a perfect algorithm, right? Because you can keep groups of counties together, or cities, or other political subdivisions, and you can have many different ways. The simulations of 5,000 simulations that creates that sort of normal distribution of maps, that's different ways of configuring things sort of naturally by combining political subdivisions. And then you have to adhere to the Voting Rights Act. Minority representation is really important. We need to find standards of political fairness and make sure that maps are fair. But yeah, these are the kinds of things. It's not a perfect algorithm, but there are certainly things that we can do in the law, either by legislating it or for me, just interpreting the law or doing it neutrally for courts, right? But that's like, there are some other things and some more details. It's not perfect, but when you keep political subdivisions together, the districts tend to be more compact. Right, compactness has a real mathematical definition. If you take a district, I have to delete the slide, but if you take a district like the Goofy kicking Donald Duck, the area inside the district, like compared to the circle size, and take the ratio, when you keep political subdivisions together, you tend to have higher values on that, more compact districts. So all these things line up. It turns out when you use that sort of algorithm, you get more fair districts. Naturally emerges that fair plans come out. So that's the kind of thing I think we should do. Of course, every state has to do this, right? If some states are doing it, which they are, and other states are not doing it, nationally you don't have fair outcomes, right?
Another
No. No. So the Voting Rights Act is sort of the last, I think, is sort of the last. The law is how it's interpreted. Like the U.S. Constitution is how it's interpreted by the current Supreme Court, right? So the current Supreme Court says that partisan gerrymandering is not, quote, justiciable, right? You can't bring claims in federal court. A different Supreme Court, I was going to use the word woke Supreme Court, but not woke, like awoke, I guess that's where the word existed from originally. Like awareness to the world, right, might rule differently. They might say, actually, the 14th Amendment, it's not just about minority representation, it's about all representation. And so therefore, partisan gerrymandering is a violation of the 14th Amendment. Or it's a violation of the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech. Right? Thinking again about the Pennsylvania Free and Equal Clause, which in some ways is a corollary to the First Amendment, right? If some people get to speak more loudly than others, how is that equal speech? Right? It's not. The government should be protecting us to have equal speech. And I think partisan gerrymandering is a way to create unequal speech in our government through representation. But absent changing the Supreme Court, I think, so let's use your example. The Supreme Court invalidates the Voting Rights Act in the next term, which a lot of people are putting money on that is going to happen. Mid-decade redistricting is going to explode. Because first of all, Louisiana already has said, right, we don't want to draw 2 black districts. We want to draw 1. Alabama has already said, we don't want to draw 2 black districts. I'm not even sure they want to draw 1. Georgia will undo their map. Florida will undo their map. Mississippi will undo their map. I don't have a whole list of states that would be implicated by this, but it's a lot of states, right, that 100% certainly will redo their maps immediately to eliminate Democratic districts that are only existent because of the Voting Rights Act. So I don't want to be pessimistic because it's not going to happen, right?
Another question.
I'm wondering, in cases where the gerrymandering has occurred, what's their batting average? Does it ever come back to fail what they were trying to do? And I hope this time it does too.
Not lately. Okay, so in the 1990s, Democrats controlled most state legislatures because the South was like the solid South, Democratic. And so the Democrats drew wild gerrymanders, prior to the 1990s. I mean, California wildly gerrymandered. Wild gerrymanders, okay? And in 1990, you have what some people have referred to the end of the Civil War, right? Like, kind of a joke, but not really, right? So like, the South transition from Democrat to Republican in 1994 was sort of the end of that. And what happened is that all those Democratic gerrymanders backfired. So there's a term for this, again, my mentor, because he's kind of like central in all the redistricting in the last 40 or 50 years, coined a term that the US Supreme Court has cited many times called dummy-mander. Right, it's when you draw a map that backfires. So in Texas, a lot of people thought that the map that this legislature was going to draw last month was going to be a dummy-mander because they thought they were going to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Wasn't that funny? They just didn't comply with the Voting Rights Act. And it's not, I showed you, it's not a dummy-mander. In every election for which I have data for, right, Republicans gain seats. So it could be a situation, again, where tides turn. Maybe Republican voters get tired of Trump and en masse leave the Republican Party and vote Democrat. And a lot of these states, the maps will have the effect of being a dummy-mander, right, including places like Texas. But absent a voter realignment, it's probably not going to happen. And the reason for this is that legislators got sophisticated. Right? They learn from past mistakes and they don't make those mistakes anymore. They're cautious. In fact, I think I read today, I'm trying to remember what state, maybe it was Indiana, was going to meet with President Trump. The legislators were going to go meet with President Trump to discuss redistricting. Or maybe it was Democrats. Maybe I read it was Hakeem Jeffries was saying that he was not going to endorse certain redistricting in blue states because it may end up impacting Democratic incumbents if things don't go as expected in the 26 midterm, right? So, for instance, if Illinois already has a pretty aggressive gerrymander favoring Democrats, there's only 3 seats that are held by Republicans in Illinois. If Democrats attempt to draw the map in a way to gain 1 or 2 or 3 more seats, they have to take Republican voters out of those 3 districts and put them into Democratic districts. That might make the margins so close that if the election are not solidly in favor of Democrats, that they could lose all those districts. So it could be risky. But they're pretty careful not to do these, is the answer. So I don't think there are any states where there are a backfire potential absent a realignment. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Jonathan one more time.
I want to highlight here that we're at a stage right now where politics often feels like sports. Commentators on these TV stations, but whether it's Fox News, MSNBC, feel like they're sports commentators. They almost draw the numbers as if it's like a score. But I think what Jonathan to me highlights, all this stuff, all these drawn maps, these aren't territories and these aren't numbers. Democracy is ultimately the most humane form of government we can have because it affirms the dignity of that individual. And to say that that dignity of that individual should not supersede the dignity of any others. And I think that is really, really important. It's important that we as MICA are not a partisan organization. We believe in justice and we believe in the voice of every single person. So what does that mean? So that now we are 60 years from the Voting Rights Act. This country has been through a lot. Human beings, go back to the year before the Voting Rights Act in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and how much even in light of like now we're seeing this grave injustice, how much people sacrificed and how much they had to have a hope for something better in the future. That's what we're called to do here as a local movement, is to have a hope for something better in the future and to affirm that dignity of that individual human being by affirming what democracy means. The shirts out here say we are the pro-democracy organization. That's what it means. It's not like just a dumb social justice rant. It's an affirmation of that human dignity. So, yeah, this is not, yes, affirmation of human dignity right there. So, what does that call on us to do? I think we're in a country right now where democracy is a means to some end for a lot of people, not an end in itself. And we need to affirm what we think is important about democracy. We need to stand up for the people who are potentially going to lose that vote, knowing that that Voting Rights Act was ultimately an affirmation of the human dignity of people who were African American or who were underrepresented, who were thrown aside and said that their value as human beings, if we think about democracy as an affirmation of that human being, as an affirmation of human existence, that their value as a human being didn't matter. We need to affirm that. And to say that, wrong, Donald Trump, nobody is entitled to 5 more votes. Nobody's entitled to having their representation taken away. So we need to continue to advocate for that, even if, Jonathan, you are wrong and the Voting Rights Act goes down. We still need to be an affirmation of a hope for a better future for that wonderful human being that just walked around here. That's our responsibility. So we need to continue to show up to these things. We need to continue to be hopeful. And we need to reject this sort of sports mentality of what it means to be a human being, to be a government, to be an institution, because these are ultimately not sports. They're a representation of the individual value of those human beings. And we need to constantly be affirming that. We're actually, I think I'll talk to a lot of you, like we believe in these sorts of principles, and we need to do it when it's hard. So, I don't agree with Charlie Kirk on political issues, but what happened yesterday in terms of political violence is just plain out wrong. And we need to be able to affirm that. Because every single human being, whether we end up agreeing with them or don't agree with them, have inviolable worth. And that's what democracy is an affirmation of that worth of that individual. So it is easy right now to be in a sports mentality and to go back to your political sports team, but let's continue as MICA to affirm that individual worth of of each of our brothers and sisters, even if we don't agree with them, even if they negate our existence for whatever reason. Let's do better than that. And I am grateful that this is just like this is an exhausting week. So thank you to those of you who've gone to the fair and volunteered. Thank you for those of you who marched in a parade this week. Thank you for those of you who entertained the fact that I had this giant inflatable, not going to finish that statement, but this syringe and advocating for vaccines, because every single one of those things is an affirmation of the human being. When we advocate for vaccines, we're saying that human beings matter, all of us matter, and that you don't get to just avoid, just because you don't want to take a vaccine, violate the rights of everybody else to live, because everybody has that worth. Everything we do is an affirmation of every single human being's worth. So let's continue that. This is going to be a really big month, continue to be a big month for us, and next month is going to be that. And we need every single one of you to continue to draw new people into this conversation, to draw them into this community that affirms the individual worth of those human beings. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll continue to see you at many different events.